welcome to this evening's Farm Advisory Service webinar. We've got a few people just continuing to join. Tonight we are focusing on fodder beet again, like we did last week, but this week rather than sheep, we're focusing on beef. Again, we are very, very lucky to have Jim Gibbs speaking. He is joining us from New Zealand, and he has been absolutely instrumental in designing grazing systems for beet. So he has seen the good and the bad and the ugly with what can go right and what can go wrong with beef. So he is absolutely brilliant to have along tonight and to speak to us. So please make use of him while we have him. Ask questions, use the question panel, and don't leave tonight saying you wish you'd asked something. Just please ask it. So we aim to run for about an hour, unless we've got a heap of questions, and then we will try and just plough on and get through all the questions. And as I say, ask the questions. You'll get out of it what you put into it. So please do ask the questions. Just got a photo here of Jim standing in a field up in Inverness, just to show that yes, he is from New Zealand. He works in New Zealand, but he very much understands the beet systems over here in Scotland as well. And that was last year. He was over and he visited some farms in Scotland, and very much understands the ground conditions, the climate that we're working with as well. So I've said to ask questions. This is how you go about it. You've got a panel over on the right hand side. There is an orange arrow that will make it bigger and smaller. You've got questions, and just type in your question, and myself and Malcolm, who's helping in the background with technical problems, the two of us will keep an eye on the questions and we'll put them to Jim at the end. So really simple to do, and no question is a silly question. So please do type in any questions that you've got. We're going to start with just a few poll questions as well, just for Jim to get a kind of feeling of who the audience is. So we've got 2 poll questions, and it will come up with the question and a multiple choice. So you just click on the multiple choice. If it doesn't let you do it, if you just press escape, that'll minimize your screen, and then it should let you do it, and then you can maximize your screen again. So first poll question, can you please launch it for us, Malcolm? So have you fed fodder beet to cattle before? So this is specific to cattle. If you've only fed sheep, then say no. If you've fed cattle, then say yes. So last week we asked a question about sheep, if you'd grown it for 1 to 2 years, 3 to 5 years, and the majority of people were new to growing beet. So it'll be interesting if we're the same tonight with people being new to cattle. So yes, 65% have not grazed it with cattle before, Jim. So this is the majority of new folk. Next question is asking what you're thinking about feeding it to. So you've got the beet in the ground. Are you thinking of feeding it to suckler cows, finishing cattle, or weaned calves? So it looks like the majority coming in is going towards suckler cows. So we have got the majority suckler cows, 52% suckler cows, and then the remaining 25% between finishing cattle and weaned calves. So that is really interesting to see where people are going to be feeding their beet. So I'm going to hand over to Jim. Jim is going to talk us through the basics of beet. He's going to take us through various different systems. And cattle are so different from sheep on beet. So the completely different messages you'll be hearing tonight from Jim from what you were hearing last week. And the 2 different species should be handled very differently on beet. So Jim, over to yourself.
Well, thank you, Kirsten, and welcome to the Scottish audience. I'm tickled pink to be here this evening, your time. I'm really looking forward to it. As Kirsten said, I've got lots of time, so happy to answer all the questions that you wish. It was good to see the number of new entrants who are interested in this, and also that there's an emphasis on Suckler cows, so I'll make sure to do that in this presentation. So I'll just kick the presentation off now. There we go. Okay, so we'll go over some very basic information around the fodder beet crop again, largely because that information on the crop is always important to what we physically do with it, practical terms with these different stock classes. And then we'll look to spend some time on finishing cattle, the 14-16 month, which is effectively finishing weaners, and the older adult cattle, and then spend some time looking directly at Suckler cow systems and the peculiarities of that, and then talk briefly a little bit around some alternate uses of beet where the beet's been taken out to pasture. So some of the very straightforward things around this to get through is that when we're looking at beet crops, there's a couple of things in particular that are pretty much always a component of them. And the first is that it's a really high yielding crop, a far higher yielding crop than any of the forage alternatives that we have. And the second important component with it is that it's a really high energy crop. So it's also the highest energy forage crop we have. And if you put the two of them together, they're a very profitable system, but they also account for most of the difficulties that we see in transitioning onto beet, and where we spend all of our time, and where we'll spend quite a bit of time this evening. On account of both of those things, I have a lot of dry matter in any square metre, and it's a very sugar-rich, high-energy dry matter that's very positive for production and for profit, but has to be managed carefully when I'm adapting cattle to it. And then the other component to be aware of with beet is that when we're grazing beet, we're effectively grazing two feeds in one crop, and they're very different feeds. The first is, an agronomically well-managed crop, I'll have approximately 25% of the total dry matter of the plant up in the leaf. The remainder will be down in the bulb, and they represent two very different feeds to ruminants. The leaf will contain a lot of the protein and a lot of the macro minerals, particularly calcium and phosphorus. The bulb, on the other hand, has a relatively low crude protein content, and it really is an energy bomb. By dry weight, it'll be approximately 50% sugar, and then in addition to that, some really digestible fibre. But its value in the diet is that it's simply providing energy. Now, what this practically means is that grazing it the way that we're going to describe this evening, that we always have to have a balance between that leaf and that bulb. Now, you'll see as we go through, that hasn't always been true in most beet systems that have been used in the UK, principally because primary grazing of that crop is a relatively new phenomenon. And it's very important to make sure that we get that balance of energy and protein. If we don't, we lose intake and we lose production and profit. One point to note, we're going to be talking, with few exceptions here, we're going to be talking about transitioning these animals across to what amounts to completely unrestricted intakes. So this slide is just a general understanding. What's different about the grazing systems that we're going to describe than what some in the audience may have been used to, particularly traditional use of fodder beet in the UK, generally in Scotland in particular, is that we would be using that beet as a primary diet, and by that we mean in most beef cases that will be more than 90% of the total diet. So that beet will be grazed directly out of the ground in most cases as the primary diet, and there'll be a very low input of other feeds into it. So I'll use the word supplement in most cases, and by supplement what I really mean is some sort of roughage component. So for example, that supplement to the beet crop might be pasture. It might also be good quality silage, particularly in the young stock, or it might be hay, or it might be straw in the case of Suckler cows. But what it means is that the non-beet component of the diet will always be restricted. And that's really important in terms of profitability, and we'll see that with each livestock class as we march through it. So we'll begin with the earliest of the systems for beef here in New Zealand, and then we'll talk about finishing adult cattle after that. So One of the difficulties that we have in temperate pasture-based systems is that you have a fluctuation over the seasons in quality and quantity of feed. Of course, you're well aware of that in Scotland. And it's interesting in recent times that there's a greater and greater interest by urban demographics, often wealthy urban demographics, in buying meat that is pasture-fed. And the understanding behind that is probably derived in most parts as a reaction to, it started really in North America in lots of ways, where it was a reaction to feedlots. And right or wrong, people were deciding that they didn't want to spend their money on that sort of beef, that they'd prefer beef that was, in their eyes, more natural. And that was this idea of sort of pasture-fed beef. For whatever the reasons are behind it, the facts are that the market for labelled pasture-fed beef is growing very, very strongly all around the world, particularly in the Western world. And as a consequence, it seems more and more active that there's premiums around doing so. One of the difficulties that pasture-fed beef systems have, which New Zealand and Scotland share strongly because of latitude, is that in season you have tremendous grass, and in other seasons you have none at all. So in our case, in spring, we grow about 60% of what we're going to grow in the whole year in a few short months. And then we typically have pretty dry summers. We don't grow a lot of grass there. We have cold winters. Nothing grows much under snow. So in those cases, we're limited to the amount of feed that we have. So the typical slaughter age for pasture-fed beef through our largest processor in New Zealand is 26 to 36 months old. Now, that older animal presents a bit of a challenge from a marketing point of view. The first one is that it's really difficult to have continuity of supply in that system. So in the case of New Zealand in particular, overwhelmingly, almost exclusively, these animals are spring-born. So it means that they have the same vagaries of the season for the whole annual national crop. And what that means is that they are often arriving at the works at a pretty similar time. So if you've got contracts for pasture-fed beef, particularly prime pasture-fed beef, then it'd be quite difficult in some cases with a genuine lack of continuity supply across different months. So that really gets in the way of marketing and achieving some of the premiums that we want out of pasture-fed beef. The second component is that pasture-fed beef, as a rule, compared to the grain finish options with them, has been demonstrated time and time again to have a lighter carcass weight at similar slaughter times. So even if they're older animals, to have a lighter carcass weight and have less fat, both intramuscular and subcutaneous fat. And a component of that is that carcass in the end reflects nutritional history as well as the immediate nutritional history. But the other component is that in general terms, true pasture feeding represents a lower energy intake at critical components, except for a relatively short period in spring. So with that sort of background, one of the first developments that we did in beef finishing in New Zealand was to look at a way of increasing efficiency on farm. And there's a lot of reasons to desire that efficiency, but the short one is that if we're finishing them on an annualized system in 1 year rather than 2, then clearly we're doubling the stocking rate that farms can hold, and that's a big impact on their profitability. If we're turning off younger carcasses that are suitably finished at that point, then we're also getting around some of the issues with older carcasses and the variability in quality. From a processor point of view, that works pretty well. And it also gives us the opportunity to hold these animals and distribute them across different months. So that again helps with continuity of supply. But the principal driver for many of the farms using the system we're about to describe here now is that it can make use of feed on farm when they have it. So in springboard animals, what happens is that they're born in spring, they stay on the cow through to the autumn where they're weaned. The fodder beet crop was also planted in spring, used the heat units in that warmer weather to bank a lot of very high quality feed at enormous yields. And then at the time of weaning these animals, there's a large feed resource that can hold them right through autumn, right through winter, and right through spring until the grass is up and hopping. And then at that point, they can make the use of unrestricted spring grass intakes to take them to slaughter weights and be finished before the grass finishes itself in summer. So it can be a very efficient system that fits the temperate production cycle of pastures. So with that background, we'll do some practical bits on it. What would happen in most of these cases is that we'd look for steers that are above 250 kilos and preferably above 270 kilos. And they would have been recently weaned, and they would then be put on in autumn for 150 odd days on the beet crop using very restricted other supplement, wherever possible, co-grazing with a small amount of pasture. And that would mean that by the time they came off that in early spring, in most cases, occasionally in mid-spring in some of the colder areas, they'd be 400 odd kilos. They then have 90 odd days of really good quality, unrestricted intakes, and we look for a target slaughter weight of about 530 kilos. Perhaps in questions we can come back to why we picked that carcass weight, live weight, but the processors in New Zealand like carcass weight of 270 kilograms or above. Most of the producers want a carcass weight of 300 kilograms. So the yields on beet, the carcass yield to live weight yield percentage on beet is a lot higher than it is on pasture-based systems alone. Our pasture-based systems normally report yields of 52% quite dependably, and our British animals, the Angus and Hereford on beet, will have 56% plus yields, and the Europeans 58% plus yields. So a 530 kilogram carcass weight represents live weight represents a 300 kilogram carcass weight. So what that means is that we're targeting what the processors really like at that point. And it's a very efficient system because we're really getting rid of all those animals at the end of the flush of grass at spring before we go any further into drier areas in summer. Okay, so what's the practical reality on how we do it? Well, a lot of these weaners will come out of systems that are beef cows in the hills, so they can be a little bit wild and woolly. And when they're pulled down out of the hills and then they're weaned, we make sure that we give them a period of time where they're on a really good quality pasture or forage. In most cases, this serves two purposes. They often haven't had any experience of electric wires up to that point, so they have to be trained behind electric wires and having people closer to them. But also, if they've been on hard country prior to that, then it's a really positive adaptation if they can adapt their rumen to having good quality feed for 3 weeks or so before they go on to beet. It speeds up their transition to the beet and their live weight gains once they're on the beet. It's not impossible to do it without this, but it's more difficult and it's rarely done. So this is a very common thing in New Zealand. The other components with the young stock in particular, which are absolutely vital, are that they're vaccinated against clostridial diseases. So that's simply the common 5-in-1 vaccines. There's no particular requirement to have any of the alternative clostridial vaccines used, like for example the 10-in-1s or so. It's the issues that you have on crop with clostridial disease are with Clostridium perfringens type D, which many of the Scottish audience would know as poppy kidney in lambs, for example. And that's well protected against by the simple clostridial 5-in-1 vaccines. However, the young stock in particular are very sensitive to clostridial disease, typically well after transition when they're achieving maximum intakes. And if there's not a full vaccination program on them, then the losses can be significant. So it's well worth making sure that they have these vaccinations a month apart before they go onto the crop. Because when they're on the crop, if they're not having any pasture access at that time, if they're being fed silage, for example, then they no longer have a larval burden. So there's no parasite burden on the crop or in the conserved feed. So we would typically drench them before they go onto the crop. And then if they're held without pasture on that period, then they don't have to have any further drenches. It's not very common for the most productive systems not to have pasture. They will typically, wherever possible, use graze pasture because it's the most profitable and productive system that you can have with these young stock. But in those cases, they will have to have another drench. What we would always do with these, in addition to that, is make sure that their trace element status is adequate. Now, I'm conscious that this varies from area to area and certainly from nation to nation, but in most cases, their demand for copper and selenium in particular is quite high. They're putting on a lot of live weight gain. They're growing much faster than they ordinarily would. So their demand for this is very strong. The beet plant, as a rule, doesn't have a lot of selenium and a lot of copper. So we're very careful to make sure that they are supplied with that. Cobalt, iodine, and zinc, for that matter, are other ones that we would ordinarily pay attention to. In nearly all cases, this would be direct injection into these animals. It is possible to have it put out as a feed, for example, sprinkled across silages and other bits and pieces. It's much more difficult. What doesn't work, and I want to be very clear on this, what doesn't work and what will cost you money if you're trying to use it is the supply of trace elements through the water in these systems through autumn and winter. Well, a little later we might come back to the water intakes when they're on maximum beet intakes, but particularly in the young animals that prefer lower dry matter varieties, if they're achieving maximum dry matter intakes, they're achieving very high water loads. And those water loads are usually well overhydrating them. So it's very common for these animals to go several months across this period without drinking at all. So in those cases, putting trace elements in the water is a very ineffective way of supplying it. Not very commonly in young stock, but certainly in older stock on occasion, people will put out mineral licks, often with salt and molasses to attract them. It's very important to note that there's some strong research over the supply of minerals through free choice or voluntary licks like this over many years. And one thing that's characteristic in the literature is that even in animals that are made to be artificially induced to be quite deficient in various mineral components, the maximum uptake of free choice supplements is about 80%, or another way of putting it, up to 20% of the group will never go near them. So they're almost never used in these aggressive, high production young systems. It's just a very ineffective way of supplying it. So in nearly all of these cases, we'd either supply boluses directly and or injections. So how do you actually do it? Well, transition is a really important component to beet because we said earlier that we've got a crop that has a very high sugar component. So if you like, the easiest comparison to think of is this is not very far away from adapting cattle onto cereal grains. Now, nobody would put out a trailer full of cracked wheat and put the cattle onto it and say, work yourself out. I think everybody would understand pretty quickly what was likely to happen. Well, beet isn't very different for that. It's a pretty similar ME. It's a very rapidly available and fermentable carbohydrate. And if those animals eat too much too soon, and note, it's not too much, it's too much too soon, then what happens is that you can induce ruminant acidosis in them. Now, ruminant acidosis has a number of effects, but and very significant stock health effects, significant illnesses and even death. But it's not very common to have that expressed in these weaner systems. The way that they regulate their intake's a little better and slower than it is in older animals, and you typically won't see clinical acidosis if you've made a mess of transition. What you see later on is a very wide range of live weight gains. And so the short story on transition, because we'll return to that several times in this webinar, but the short story on transition is that it's the most important 2 or 3 weeks of the entire season. And it's much more important in beef finishing systems than it is in any other livestock class. If you get transition wrong in beef, you cannot rescue the rest of the season. So I want to be very clear for the audience that you hear that clearly. If you get that transition wrong, probably in the young stock, you won't know you've got it wrong. The time that you'll find that you've got it wrong is at the end of the season when you've got poor live weight gains. And you will not rescue it that season if you've done it wrong. So that transition is a really important component of getting young stock on. Now, the difficulty that you have is that you have a structured increase in the amount of material that those animals have to have. Now, in adult animals, that's about 1 kilo of dry matter a day, and in young stock, it's half a kilo of dry matter a day. So we'll just return to one of the points we made earlier, which was we have a really high yielding crop. If I have, our upper yielding crops this year in New Zealand are now in the mid 40 tonnes. So if I have 43 tonnes of dry matter per hectare, I have 4.5 kilograms almost of dry matter in 1 square metre. So you can see the difficulties that are presented with young stock when you have to restrict them. Now, what we would do is we would restrict them to 0.5 kilogram of dry matter to begin with, and then we have to fill the rest of their diet up so that they're well fed. And once that means they're in positive weight gain, they're not hungry and they're not putting pressure on the live weight, on the hot wire. once they're eating, we can then move them up half a kilo every second day, and we just keep moving them up until they're leaving beet behind. And we'll come back to that in a moment. But it's important to note in these young animals, there's two difficulties here. The first one is while beginning them on half a kilo a day, it's very important not to move off that half a kilo a day until you're confident that the whole group is eating bulb. Young stock in particular are the single most fussy group that we have to deal with. They're fussy about the crop, they're fussy about the cultivar, they're fussy about timing. So it's really important to make sure that these animals are eating bulb. One of the difficulties is that nearly all livestock will come onto beet and eat leaf. They quite like the leaf. It looks like grass to them in some fashion, and they don't have any learning process to begin eating that. They can eat it straight away, and they do. A lot of people mistake that for eating the bulb. Now, in young stock in particular, it's really common to have 5 or 7 days before that group is capable and adequately eating any bulb. So while we say that we're starting at half a kilo of dry matter a day and then moving up, it's often that we're on day one, so to speak, for a full week. And it's very important that you don't move up in that period of time. If you do move up, what you'll have is a group of these animals that are often 25 or 30% that aren't eating anything at all. And that means that there's space in that mob for another 25 or 30% who do like it and who are eating vigorously to eat double. Now, at the early introductory doses of this, half a kilo, 1 kilo, that's not too big a problem. When you're getting up to 3 kilos or 4 kilos, then it becomes an immediate problem with rumen acidosis. So it's very important to get that transition right. They would then stay on that crop for 150 days or so, and the important component about that is that they're not removed from that crop, and the amount of crop planted is planned on the basis that they won't be removed on that crop until the spring grass is going well. So it's not until the beginning of spring, it's until the spring grass is really up and moving. And at that point, they're directly taken off the crop, so they have no check at all in their intakes, and they're put immediately onto the grass and then made the most of that good spring flush of grass. On a practical basis with transition to beet, with young stock, one thing that really helps is while they're being transitioned or while they're being adapted to the hot wire in that first couple of weeks, it really helps if some beet is taken out to them on pasture. So if beet can be scraped up with a normal tractor bucket or with a beet bucket and taken out to them on pasture and run over with the tractor so it's smashed up, it helps the adaptation period because it teaches them to mouth the bulbs, and a greater proportion of them will move onto it quicker if you can do that. It can be a very effective way of pre-transitioning, but note at some point they still have to come back onto the crop. And so allocating them properly and giving them the right amount and giving them the space and the time to do that is still the most important component of transition. Okay, are there any special requirements? Well, note what we said before about the clostridial diseases, particularly in some environments with leafy cultivars and maximum intakes, you will pretty much find dead in the paddock all of the animals that you missed with vaccination. So in certain circumstances, that becomes a very high challenge to them and you have to be quite careful, and that vaccination is a sort of category 1 priority. The second one that we mentioned is that they are a lot fussier around the crop itself and the cultivars used. They will respond to agronomically well-managed crops. So as a general rule, leafier, greener crops are always more palatable to stock regardless of the cultivar. And you can shift cultivar palatability up and down by how well you manage it agronomically. So it's really important to have good quality leaf, and that shifts how easy it is to put these animals onto it. Note also that increasing nitrogen and later nitrogen agronomically has a couple of effects. It increases the proportion of leaf that's grown in the crop, and it increases the nitrogen content of both the leaf and the bulb. Now, because there's a higher crude protein requirement in young stock, it's necessary to have this. And so I'll put it plainly to the audience, if you've got an agronomically poorly managed crop, it's stunted, it's deep in the ground, the leaves all disappeared in autumn, you're probably not going to produce well off that with that beef system that year. You just have to draw a line through it and do what you can and accept that next year you're going to try again and get it right. So there's two things that can spoil your year before you even start, so to speak. The first one is poor agronomy, and then the second one is poor transition. You don't rescue either of those in that season. You just have to wait till next year. The other really important components about these systems are the supplement itself. And the first thing to say about that supplement is if you are giving them more than 1 kilogram a day in dry matter, you are reducing your beet input and you will automatically reduce your profit. In fact, your live weight gains, rather than be the 1 kilogram or so a day, which they should be, your live weight gains will almost certainly be down 500-600 grams a day. Now, note, it's not very difficult to give an extra kilo or so to these animals if you're not careful. So 1 kilogram of dry matter can be easily missed in systems, and often people are working under the assumption that these animals will work out how much they want themselves and they'll eat the right amount of supplement, and that's simply not true. In these very productive systems, if you want maximum production and profitability, you have to make sure that you carefully restrict the dry matter of the supplement that they're, whatever it is, pasture or silage that they're given. The second component is that there's a requirement for a reasonable protein content in the supplement used. What that practically means is that the use of poor quality silages or hays or straw should be abandoned. They're not helpful. There's no requirement in them for that roughage and fibre, no requirement at all. The total fibre requirements for the most profitable and productive of these diets can be met by 90% beet and 1 kilogram of graze pasture, nothing else. So the supplement system that's in place should make sure to be reasonable protein quality, and also particularly in high latitudes when you don't have a lot of leaf in challenged crops like that, it becomes an issue with the fat soluble vitamins A, D and E if there's no green material in the diet for long periods of time. So therefore the supplement should be carefully attended to. In terms of the final thing with them, we said that they're quite fussy, and it's a slower transition than it is in the adult cattle, and you just have to be quite patient with them, but particularly patient in the early part of that transition. So the time to pay the most attention is to not move them until you're confident that all the animals are eating bulb. That's one of the reasons, which we'll return to later, why transitioning animals by timing is an idea that will ordinarily cost you profit quickly. So for example, rather than allocating the right amount of feed, putting them on for 20 minutes a day, 40 minutes a day, 60 minutes a day, and working your way up like that, pretty much guarantees that there's a group that aren't eating, and they'll be guaranteed that there's a group that's overeating. And again, you're not going to see clinical acidosis in young animals. What you see is poor live weight gains in the end and great variability. Now we'll move to the second system, which is the rising 2-year-olds in most cases. So in springborn, pardon me, in springborn animals, this would have been autumn animals that are about 18 months old. Now, in most cases, again, this is targeting a carcass weight of about 550 odd kilos, and it's targeting that to be put in for a really good, strong processor schedule price in that late winter and early spring period when there's not a lot of good prime beef around. So this system in New Zealand was set up specifically for that. In those cases, we take steers that are about 440 kilos. We can take them lighter, but we typically like them at about 440 kilos, and they would come in mid-autumn. They then spend somewhere up to 100 days directly on that crop. There's no other grass in this system at all, so there's no period after that, and then they're slaughtered directly off the crop, typically at those target weights of above 550 kilos of live weight. Our average budgeted minimum gain on this is about 1.3 kilos a day through that colder autumn and winter environment. So the live weight gains on this can be very strong. I've known them to be 2 kilograms a day through different periods. And the critical component of this is, from a land use point of view, that they're only on the crop. They come into the crop and then they leave directly off the crop. So they're very different from the system we've described with the younger animals before. So what would happen in this case is that we start them off on 1 to 2 kilograms of dry matter. So that's allocated again, almost always in these cases, directly on crop. And again, to keep them off the hot wire and to keep them fully fed and going forward, they have to have the rest of their diet filled up. That will be something around 6 or 7 kilograms of something else, some other supplement to that beet in their diet. In most cases, wherever we can with this will be co-grazing. So one end of the paddock or so would be used co-grazing across that transition because it's a cheaper way to supply a lot more bulk in terms of that supplement. Again, very important, the critical component of transition is to know your yield, to allocate it well, and to not move them until all of these animals are eating. And they're eating that 1 kilogram of beet to begin with, and to not move them off that, and to not increase that allocation until everybody's eating it. Now, that becomes really important again when you get up to 3 or 4 or 5 kilos. If you haven't done that well, you'll have a group there that are eating double and a group there that are eating nothing. Now, eventually, the group that are eating nothing will have nothing else to eat, so they'll start eating beet, they always do, and then they go from 0 to 100 in no time at all, and you have trouble with them as well. Meanwhile, the overeating group have already given you trouble, and in these older animals, you will see clinical acidosis, not as strongly as you'll see in dairy cows, but you do see animals that are, in the New Zealand farmer parlance, they're called wobblers. So what will happen is they're wobbly, they're all wobbly and drunk and ataxic. The reason is that the very first effect of ruminant acidosis and sugar-rich systems like this is to restrict the amount of calcium available to the animal. So even in these steers, like the examples in front of you, you're producing milk fever in them by ruminant acidosis. It's the very first sign that you see. Now, having seen that sign in that group is a pretty sure way to guarantee that you've now reduced the average live weight gain of that whole mob for the whole season. So once again, that transition is an absolutely critical component of profitability, productivity on that crop. What we would practically do is that we would allocate them to that, make sure that they're eating it by putting them onto the beet hungry. So they're not going onto the beet full of supplement or anything else. They're going onto those early allocations when they're hungry, and they're left on there for a reasonable length of time so that they understand that nobody's coming to take them off and put them somewhere else. And that does encourage them within a couple of days, and it usually is only a couple of days, to begin eating that beet and to begin eating it hungrily. After a little while, like all cattle, there's a switch that flicks on in their head, and once that switch goes on, they learn that beet's a really good thing. After that, they'll be hungry for the beet and you'll have no difficulty at all. Once you've achieved that on the mob, then you can lift them up 1 kilogram every second day, and you keep going until they're leaving beet behind them. At that point, the supplement's dropping. Typically in the second week, it's about 4 kilos, and in the third week, it's down to 2 kilos eaten. Two things to note about this one. There's a precocious fat deposition in these animals. So if you like, they get very fat quite early on the crop. You see this in their dewlap, around behind their ears. There's a lot of subcutaneous and intramuscular fat that's being put on because it's a really energy-rich diet, well over maintenance requirements and enough to support this live weight gain, and a relatively low crude protein diet. So unlike the younger animals, their protein requirements are a little lower, somewhere around about 12% or so. And as a consequence, beet meets that easily and well. And it does account for this sort of precocious fat deposition in these animals. So going back to what we said in the early stages, one of the issues with pasture fed is that the carcass quality, particularly in older animals with a sometimes poor nutritional history, can be a bit of an issue for marketing for the processors. Well, beet is a very simple way to have very, very high quality carcasses achieved in a relatively short time, almost independent of what their previous nutritional history had been. Not exactly independent of it, but almost independent of it. And note that they're slaughtered directly off the crop at their live weight targets. Okay, what are the advantages and the limitations of these ones? Well, from a young stock point of view, the weaners, the 14 to 16 month old finishing system, it means that you're matching the feed supply on the farm. And it's a very efficient system in terms of the total resource use, but also in terms of things like methane emissions per kilogram of carcass weight. I mean, slaughtering younger animals at the appropriate carcass weights is always desirable. It has a whole lot of knock-on effects on farm, but also perhaps in consumer perception too. It obviously encourages very high stocking rates, because if you're annualizing this system, you're taking that full draft in every year. So in the New Zealand environment, that effectively doubled the stocking rate that they could hold, but because beet was a high dry matter, in most cases that increased it by 3 or 4 times. So it's a significant shift in stocking rate. Now, we mentioned before, younger carcasses always have advantages if they're appropriately fat. It's very difficult in most cases in pasture-fed animals to get 14, 16-month-old animals in forage feeding systems of any type to have appropriate fat cover, both intramuscular and subcutaneous, but it's easily achievable on beet. The highest carcass grading for the New Zealand system, as a knockabout rule of thumb, about 40% of the pasture-fed animals, and they're almost always older, achieve that highest grade. But the grading from beet systems is above 80%. So as a consequence, the processors can have some confidence with the number and the timing of these animals coming off the crop. The final point is, in some cases with these younger systems, it suits various farms not to finish them themselves on grass, but to use really high stocking rates across the winter to produce an animal to sell as a store into that grass market in spring. And that can be another effective and profitable use of them. In terms of the older systems, the 26 to 30 month finishing systems, well, they're very land use efficient because the animals require nothing but the crop. The largest systems in New Zealand for this, in the central Otago region, produce above 3,000 trade steers a year, and these trade steers are brought in, put directly on the crop, finished on the crop, and then sold directly off the crop. Now, because they're really high stocking rates, what it means is that even in those really large systems, you're still only talking about 100 or 150 hectares of beet. It's not a lot of land to have a very large number of stock turned off on it. And the other real advantage of this is it's much more difficult to get pasture-fed, prime pasture-fed beef in that late winter, early spring market. Processors historically have struggled for continuity of supply. Well, the beet systems have changed all of that. It's possible to have very large numbers of animals effectively produced on contract without any difficulty at all. And as we said before, it does make for a really high quality carcass. Okay, what goes wrong in this system? Well, the two things that really go wrong in the young stock, and this is similar to the adult stock, is that the two things that people mostly get wrong is after transition, they haven't left enough beet on the ground. It takes some seasons for people to understand the intake pattern with beet, with cattle on beet, and that is that there's a peculiarity of beet intake that they only achieve maximum intakes when you have 3 days of beet left behind you on the ground. Some people stubbornly stick to the idea that if they look down the day before, so they're moving the line, if they look down the day before and they see some beet, then well, if there's beet left over, they could eat it if they want to, they must be at maximum intakes. And it's simply not true. So the number 1 and 2, and they're interchangeable. Number 1, they're not leaving enough beet behind. They should leave 25% of the beet the day before, 10% the day before that, 5% the day before that. If you can't look behind you and see 3 days of beet, you haven't given them enough and you need to extend your allocation. And if you don't, you decrease their intakes and you decrease your profitability. On the other hand, except in very wet weather, if you look behind you and you see more than 3 days, then you're at your maximum and there's no benefit in increasing that allocation anymore. Now, the second component is talking about supplements. We said before, if you raise that over 1 kilogram of dry matter in these young stock, you immediately suppress their beet intake. Now, that can be harder to do than it first seems. So, for example, using bale feeders as a source for those animals can be very problematic. Even if you allocated it correctly to the mob size, you can pretty much guarantee you're not going to get all of those animals to politely eat 1 kilogram and wait in line with their friends. What will happen in that case is that some will eat a lot, some will get none, and again, you get highly variable live weights across that. So it can be a difficulty. So that the amount of supplement and the way that you give that supplement to give them access directly affects your live weight gain. The best way to do it wherever possible is to have strip grazing of grass. In very wet environments, of course, that can't happen, and you have to have alternative approaches to them. But it's a very important component of profitability. This is a good example of how much beet you should be leaving behind. So the scientist in the picture here is standing in the break from yesterday. So 25% of the dry matter is a lot more than most people will ordinarily think. If you look to the right of the photo, you'll see that it's dramatically reduced the day before. If we went back one more day, there's not much there, and then behind that, it's a billiard table. They'll eat it all. But you just have to get used to moving that line forward so there's lots of beet left behind. This is another good example, so you can look at it more closely. 25% is a lot more than most people think. It's 1 in every 4 bulbs kicked over. It's a lot more than people think. And here's a good example of people who thought they were doing the right thing, but had got it completely wrong. Now, these animals were at about 500 or 600 grams a day for the simple reason that they really were underdone on their intake. So you can see in both cases there's scarcely much beet on the ground, but looking down, people can see it and say, well, there's something there, they could eat if they wanted, and it just doesn't work like that. What else goes wrong? Well, they're very slow, as we said before. They are fussy on the crop and the cultivar, so poor crops and some of the cultivars are just not that palatable for them. That can be an issue, there's no question, normally will result in lower live weight gains. Poor transition in young animals, it provokes feed aversion. So if you burn them, you give a few of them mild acidosis, what you've done is you've taught them not to eat a lot of beet. All your profit is on their maximum beet intakes. You've now taught them not to eat a lot of beet. They take that lesson well and they remember it for the whole season. You cannot rescue that. Once you get it wrong, you cannot rescue it. You just wait till next year and you do it better. And note, there's a specific podcast on transition, which is probably well worth your time to listen to. But the biggest components of transition are designed beforehand, not your actual operation, but designed beforehand. And then the final one is the sudden death that we spoke about with clostridial diseases. With the older stock, it's pretty much exactly the same, but note something we said before, you won't rescue bad transition in older stock either. You'll have suppressed live weight gains because bad intakes. But the other part of it is because these are often coming onto the crop for a shorter period of time, 70 or 100 days, the previous nutritional history comes into play with how fast they begin to turn around. So if they've been hammered for that autumn before they come on, particularly if they've been losing live weight and they've been bought at a bargain or so, then they're slower to turn around on the beet. Now this system works on fairly high live weight gains with about a 15 to 30 day complete adaptation period. So not just transition to the crop, but adaptation up to full intakes and maximum live weight gain. If you've got a bad nutritional history before that, that can be a lot slower. And that can blow out how long they have to be on that crop, which can affect your profitability. So it's an issue that you have to be careful on. We have mentioned the role of trace elements in this. In very high live weight gains, you have to be more careful of trace elements than in normal pasture feeding systems. The final thing to say there, of course, there are differences both with British and European breeds and between steers and heifers in how quickly they'll fatten and what their final sort of slaughter weights will be at. And sometimes that can be used to your advantage by having mixed groups fed on them. Sometimes that becomes a disadvantage. Okay, now we'll talk about suckler cows. Suckler cows are a much easier and less aggressive feeding system than the finishing stock that we've just talked about. So in most cases with this one, they're going to be used across that gestation period and then pulled off the beet prior to calving. So whether they're going onto grass or they're going to housing a couple of weeks before calving. Now, in general terms, their transition and their supplement requirements, etc., are very similar to the adult finishing steers, so the 26 to 30 month steers and heifers. In those cases, we would ordinarily be starting them at about 1 kilogram of dry matter, and exactly as we said before, holding them on that allocation till we're confident they're all eating. They are less fussy and they eat better and quicker than what the 18-month-olds do, the 26 to 30-month finishing systems as well. They are much more straightforward in terms of hopping onto beet and beginning to eat it. What is more of an issue with them is that they're more prone to acidosis. Because they eat that well, they can eat themselves into a poor situation much easier than the finishing beef will. So as a consequence, what will happen, we would normally start them on that one, allocate them very carefully on that, and then make sure that the rest of their diet is full. That would be 7 or 8 kilograms even in heavier animals of supplement. And that supplement isn't as critical to their success of this system as it is in the younger stock. So in terms of suckler cow, you can be pretty much feed them anything that you like or a mix of anything that you like, even down to the cereal straws, and they'll do reasonably well on that. One point to note, it's very straightforward. They will dependably eat about 2.2% of what they weigh. So that means if they're heavier of these, they'll eat about 12 kilograms of beet and a couple of kilograms of supplement. If you do your sums on that, that's a metabolizable energy intake of 150 or 60. And in those cases, that's a very strong live weight or body condition gain. So it's absolutely routine for them to be gaining between half and a full body condition score if that dry period is 70 days or more. So you sometimes have to be careful with that because they can get over fat. Note that the total protein, the total diet crude protein target for them is around about that 12%, which is easily achieved on beet. Because the supplement is put in at a low level, only a couple of kilos, then in those cases, it doesn't have a great role in changing the total protein of the diet. So as a consequence, protein nutrition in general terms with them isn't such an issue. Note, restricting the supplement to very low levels is also not such an issue because we're not chasing those higher and higher intakes and live weight gains. So the way that you feed that supplement can also change. Note that the utilization typically with cows in particular is very high. They dig most things out of the ground, so the utilization levels are very high, and that has to be taken into account when you're looking at their intakes and therefore their live weight gains. And as we said before, in most cases they'd be pulled off and then put onto grass or housing a couple of weeks before calving. Now, an alternative way to do this is to supply beet out to them on pasture. This can be a very effective way logistically with grazing sacrifice paddocks or standing cereals or some other bits and pieces as well. And what it really is using is beet as an energy source to make the most of the protein component of the diet. And in this case, it's often around about 50-50. So in that case, it's a higher crude protein diet. Beet will be lifted often with a beet bucket and taken to them and spread out on the pasture. It can be done 7 days in advance and they can be moved on daily breaks. So that'd be flying out on the pasture and then the wires simply move so they have access every day, which means that you're only doing something once a week. Really positive again in terms of body condition score and milk production if it's being used in lactation, so after calving in lactation, which is probably a fairly common use for this. It does mean also that you're supplying a lot more dry matter than the standing pasture that you've got. And in those cases, you're effectively doubling the stocking rate. One thing to note, if you are transitioning to them in lactation, then it's a slower process, and particularly on grass, because they have other feed in their diet that you can't restrict. So they're not automatically going to be hungry for that. So it's a slower process. And in most cases, you'll start at that 1 to 2 kilograms of dry matter, and you'll be on that for an extended period of time. You might only be going up to 6 or 7 kilograms, but ordinarily it'll still take you 2 weeks or slightly beyond that to get up to that level. And you have to be quite careful in that early stage that you don't move off the early allocations until they're all eating it. Okay, a couple of myths and then we'll turn over to questions. The first of these and the most common myths that you'll hear around beet in general, and particularly the aggressive beef finishing systems, is something around ruminant acidosis. So it'll be expressed as overt clinical acidosis or as the risk of subclinical acidosis or some variation on that theme. And that it isn't done so much anymore in New Zealand, but in the early years of working with the beet systems, it was reasonably common. You'd hear something around about that. Mostly it's disappeared now. And the short thing to say about that is if transitioned properly to unrestricted intakes and the supplement that we've mentioned in this webinar, there is no rumen acidosis, subclinical or otherwise. It was the earliest direct rumen function work that I did, and we've done 10 years or more of that work with in situ pH recording in rumens on these diets directly over and over and over again. And paradoxically, unrestricted beet intakes with the proper amount of supplement, when they've learned to adapt their intake patterns, result in high rumen pHs, not low rumen pHs. I've pointed out plenty of times that where we used comparisons, the rumen pH profile on ryegrass fed in winter in these experimental designs was always lower than the rumen pH of these animals fed unrestricted beet. So it's simply a myth that there's issues with rumen acidosis or subclinical acidosis. Feeding management is the most important component of that. And the reason that that myth becomes important is because people then make recommendations on it. And the two recommendations, the most common ones, are either you increase the amount of supplement or you decrease the amount of beet, so you restrict feed. Increasing the amount of supplement will always reduce the amount of beet that the animals eat. So if you let them eat more supplement, they will eat it, and then they'll therefore eat the less beet, and that always costs you money. The supplements, poor ME and higher NDF, slows the intake overall, will always cost you money in these beef systems. But the second one in restrict beet feeding is more interesting. The biggest part of transition and the most important component of transition over those periods is that you are teaching the animals to regulate their intake, that they put that material into the rumen at a rate that the rumen can handle. If you like, you're teaching them to shovel coal into the boiler at a rate that doesn't melt the boiler down. Now, once they're on unrestricted intakes and they can regulate their intake as they see fit, they do that and they do that very well. If I restrict them on their intake, then I override that intake pattern because I introduce competitive grazing. They know if they don't eat it, their cousin next to them will, so they change their intake pattern. So paradoxically, restrict feeding them can result in rumen problems because they override the transition lessons that they've learned. So restrict feeding should be avoided at all costs. A couple of the other myths are that you need really high protein supplements or direct protein nuts. That's simply not true, you don't. As we said before, in all of these beef systems in particular, the protein is adequate for really high live weight gains. Sometimes you hear this in beef systems, you hear a lot more in dairy systems that there's a requirement for either calcium or phosphorus. In very rare environments in dairy systems, there is a requirement for phosphorus. It's never been noted in beef. So we never use, in none of the nations that the system's been used in, do we use phosphorus supplements in beef. Their phosphorus requirements are met by agronomically well-managed crops without any difficulty at all, particularly in the young stock, as they have to have green feed as their supplement rather than, say, straw in the case of Suckler cows. And you hear some other issues around soil intake. They're expressed in different ways. Either their teeth wear out or fall out. It does some damage to the rumen or the intestines, or that it carries a lot of disease. And in the UK, mostly the disease that's mentioned is listeriosis. Suffice to say that there's been lots of work for many, many years in all of these areas, and none of these are true. They're a very common myth. Listeria disease is extremely rare in nearly all cases. In very, very rare environments with goats that are grazing beet, you sometimes see this at a low level, but otherwise it's seen at almost immeasurably low levels. It's just that none of these are a genuine issue. The final two will say is you hear occasionally that there's oxalates in the leaf, and so you shouldn't use the leaf, or there's issues with how much of the crop. It's a complete furphy. The oxalate level is relatively low. The animals adapt to that level within 14 days, and all of these systems rely on having hard-charging, really good quality leaf held over. So it's one to strike off your list if you come across it. And then the final one is that you should be really careful about transition by increasing time on the crop. One of the difficulties with that in beef systems in particular is that it's very difficult to work out the animals that are and aren't eating the bulb. And therefore, as you're sort of stuck on increasing that time as you move forward, you almost always end up with a larger tail. You always end up with a greater variation in your live weight gain because you have taught a few of those animals not to eat beet. So you need to be very careful with that too. So our summary checklist is all the things that we've gone through here. Have I got my paddock in position? Did I think well about that design for transition before I did it? Do I know my transition? So if I know what I'm going to do, I need to know how much crop was there. I can't allocate it if I don't do that. Have I given all the preparatory materials in vaccination, drench and trace elements, etc. I need? And am I confident that I'm giving them the right amount of supplement and they've got access to it to make that transition period really smooth? Am I sure that the stock are eating? And after that, am I giving the right amount of supplement and am I making sure there's enough beet on the ground? So that's a pretty easy summary checklist to look over. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kirsten for questions.
Thank you, Jim. There has been many questions come in. I think, well, I hope everybody kind of sees the massive potential that there is in fodder beet, and for being about 50% of people saying that it was Suckler cows they were planning to feed it to. We might just flip in a poll just now, Malcolm, if that's okay, just to see if that is still what people are saying. So Malcolm, if you could maybe just launch the poll. So it's the same question as we had last time, but I'm just interested to see if there is a change in what people are thinking. Yes, so there we go, 38% Suckler cows. So at the start there was 52%, so we're almost a third. So it's interesting because I think a lot of people just think it's a feed for dry animals, for your ewes pre-lambing and for your dry cows, but you can fairly see that it's a feed that is so versatile and is able to do so much more. So it's really interesting to see the results there. I think Jim has explained it so well, all the different uses for it, and I think the fact that it's such a high yielding crop, excellent nutrition, so digestible, it's so versatile. So we have got so many questions. I'm going to start at the top, Jim. And so the first questions came in when you were speaking about your first system. So this was finishing cattle younger. And the first one is, how should fodder be fed in a TMR to finishing cattle? So this would be for finishing cattle that are in a shed, I guess, and fed in a total mixed ration.
So the short answer to that one is that it's actually more difficult than it probably sometimes seems. The interesting thing about these grazing systems is if you were to look at them on a structured basis, they break a lot of traditional rules, but they really work. And because there were some things that were different about them, for example, a very high water intake when they're eating this beet and changes some rumen function, and there's a whole series of things. One of the aspects that's very difficult to do in a total mixed ration is to give them the same access to the beet and the same sort of daily patterns of intake. So we've done quite a lot of it in a lot of countries across the world, and it is a more difficult system to use. But having said that, the short story is, in most cases, what you have to do is it's much more difficult to get the same balance of leaf and bulb and the timing of that balance that you do in the grazing system. So the way that you have to use it in mixed rations is they're going to preferentially eat the beet bulb, and they will. And even no matter how you chop it up, they learn to select it out and they get it really quickly. So what generally changes is you have to have less beet, you have to have more of a roughage component, and you have to have, in most cases, a specific protein concentrate put in that to raise that crude protein up. And all of those things make the diet, of course, slightly more complicated and a bit more expensive than the grazing diet, but they can be done. As a general rule of thumb, what will happen is you'll end up with about 80% beet and 20% other in the diet. That other being your roughage component, which in a TMR is better to be less cereal straw, for example, than it often would be, and to be better quality material, and will also involve trace element, sorry, I should say protein concentrate. So it's not as straightforward as it seems just to pick it up and put it into bunks and to use it like that. The system is really set up to be most effective when it's grazed.
And of course, when it's in a TMR as well, Jim, and if you're up to 80% beet, the transition is vitally important as well, isn't it?
Well, it is, and there's one other thing that comes into play with the use indoors. The urine production out of animals that are eating a relatively low dry matter feed is very different from animals that are eating a cereal grain-based feed. I mean, most total mixed ration for beef is around 45% dry matter. A good number of these forage systems that we discussed today are at 10% dry matter. So to give you a feel for that, you know, they might be moving between consuming something like 25 or 40 litres of water in total a day up to consuming more than 110. And a lot of that makes its way out as urine and slurry, and that can make housing a little bit more of a challenge as well.
Okay. The next question came in when you were speaking again about the younger cattle, and you were saying about giving them trace elements, so not to give it into the water. And somebody has asked, why not administer trace elements through a slow releasing bolus?
Well, there's no reason not to. I mean, in fact, there's some advantages in for young stock because nearly all of the injectable minerals don't last for 130 days. A lot of them are 60, 70 days. So if there's suitable slow-acting boluses available in the UK market for that, then they should be used. I mean, that's a great way to do it. We don't have that. We have boluses for copper, we have boluses for cobalt, but we don't have them for the full range. So in most cases, they'd be directly injected simply for the convenience in selenium, copper, cobalt, iodine, and zinc. And there's two different veterinary preparations over here that can be used for that.
Okay. Next question is, can you lift beet and feed it with the leaf still on? And I guess the other question round here that is quite similar is, can you lift beet and pit it?
So to answer the first question, lifting beet and feeding with the leaf on is done a lot in New Zealand. We've sort of invented an apparatus called a beet bucket, which just goes on the forks of the tractor. You can slide it along in front of the tractor and it'll push all the beet out of the ground. You pick it up and put it into a silage wagon. So that's really commonly done and can be done very quickly and at a great scale. Like for example, the time it takes to fill an 8-ton fresh weight silage wagon is less than 5 minutes. So it doesn't take very long. It's a very quick process. And then any of the normal silage wagons can be used to put it out on pasture. And that's a pretty common way to feed, for example, lactating dairy cows, and in your case, lactating suckler cows as well. So yeah, there's no question with that. We've done quite a bit of work on silaging over the year with beet, and to be fair to say, it hasn't always been very successful. I mean, one of the difficulties is it's a really low dry matter material, so there's an awful lot of water to be whipped up. It typically, being picked up with a beet bucket, will have a bit more soil than it will having been bounced around in a commercial sugar beet harvesting operation where they'll take the leaves off and then bounce the bulbs to get a lot of the soil off. So the bucket will hold a bit more soil than that, and sometimes that can be a problem in silaging too. But having said that, some of the companies have been working pretty hard on silaging opportunities for a few years now, and they've made great gains in doing so. And I mean, two things in particular is in siling it with other material has proved to be reasonably effective. And one of the things that we've been wobbling around with a while is the use of gases. So this is plastic covered silages where we're tube often where we're gassing them. And in those cases, it can work really well. But there's a bit more of a challenge than normal in siling. No question around about that. If there was one practical way that farms would be doing that on New Zealand, it would be what they would call sandwiching. So they typically have either a whole crop cereal or a grass, and they would put that down in the silage pit, then they would put beet in on top of that, then they put more grass on, then put more beet on top of that. So they end up with like a club sandwich of this, and it's fed out. That can be a very effective way of silaging, but of course it's harder work, and you have to coordinate the time of grass and beet harvesting. Can be tricky.
The next question, I think, is asking for a golden nugget. Apart from late applied nitrogen, how do you get leaf to last longer?
No, that's not an uncommon question in the UK, and I'd preface the question by saying this. In New Zealand, we inherited the British and European systems of sugar beet agronomy for fodder beet grazing, and we didn't question that at all in the early years. And it's interesting to note that where it's been looked at in the Southern Hemisphere and other places, several research components in Australia in the 90s and 2000s, in New Zealand in the 80s where there was an interest in biofuels, the yields were almost identical to what they are in the UK now. They were almost identical in the sense that they'd be in the high teens and the low sort of 20s. And, you know, over a period of some years, our shifts in agronomy have been first and foremost in fertiliser, using split applications, using a lot more nitrogen and using it a lot later. The other shifts have been in recently in row widths. We don't see the reason to have the rows anymore, and yields increased by 30% if you narrow the rows up and keep similar sort of seed numbers, and seed spacing up the row can change that as well. So I preface that by saying that to get really good quality leaf in the late season, my suggestion is you have to do a lot of little things well. And so there isn't a silver bullet that can fix that by either late nitrogen or anything else. But having said that, having no weed pressure early on, so being agronomically sensible early on and doing what you need to do, achieving really good canopy closure by sensible fertilizer to begin with, and then keeping that nitrogen and potassium, not just nitrogen, but nitrogen and potassium in many cases going on in split applications right late into the season is a really important component in New Zealand in keeping leaf in challenging environments. Our biggest beet grazing systems are in the highland environments where it's really cold. So, you know, as we said before, commonly below 5, below 0, and can have snow events, etc. So they're cold weather challenges for them, and we hold good leaf into winter, even in those circumstances. So there's a few things that need to be done well agronomically. My guess is, having talked to people and worked in the UK for a few years now, that those shifts in agronomy are happening. And I think you're going to see more and more of that, particularly in Scotland in the next years to come. But the late nitrogen is certainly a big component of that. And by late, I mean to flip the hemispheres over and to put it in your perspective, late for us would be October for you. So, you know, this is certainly quite late nitrogen for what you're used to.
Another agronomic question, and this is one I've heard somebody ask you lately, is there any issues with growing beet in the same field each year?
Now that's a more difficult one to answer because it's very regional. As a general rule of thumb, internationally, and of course sugar beet is a major crop internationally, and there's you know, excellent agronomy around sugar beet for many, many years. It would always be suggested that there has to be a strong rotation, and that rotation might be 1 year in 3, 4, 5. I've heard even taller in some places in the UK. And the reason for that rotation is that there's a number of the important diseases that are carried in throw-offs from the crop, so pieces of bulb, pieces of leaf, etc. And Beetus nematodes are one good example of that. In those cases, if you're double cropping, you're encouraging disease. And I think that there's enough sugar beet grown across the UK in general over enough years for people to have a pretty good feel for that. And the consensus would seem to be in most cases that that rotation is absolutely important to do so. Having said that, we also inherited those ideas in New Zealand, and we don't do them at all. In fact, double cropping is absolutely routine in beef situations. But I would preface that by saying we really don't have the disease pressure issues in our soils that you do in the UK. We don't. We have Beetus nematode here, but it's never an issue. We have no. Really, it's functionally completely unimportant. We never give it any consideration. So in our cases, while we do it quite a lot, I don't think that it's a good idea in the UK. Unless there was agronomic advice to the contrary, I think that it's probably more sensible to keep that rotation in place.
Okay. The next question, again, we're back to agronomy and we're looking at direct drilling. So can we direct drill the crop into old pasture? And what are the crop's nutritional requirements for good establishment, and is the crop frost hardy?
It's certainly frost hardy. There's no issue with that. And so I'll answer the question. I'll go to the end first, then I'll walk back to the beginning. My first suggestion is don't do it. Don't do it. Direct drilling has always been something that producers are interested in wherever you go. And we've done a lot of direct drilling, even precision direct drilling here in New Zealand for some years. It always results in a significant crop yield loss. So you start at about 5 tonnes and you can move up to 10 tonnes less than you would if you had conventional approaches to cultivation and agronomy of the crop. So my first advice would be, unless there's a very good reason, and in New Zealand those only reasons are we've got very challenging slopes, or we've got very low topsoil, where if we cultivate it, it's all sand underneath it, for example, and you'll have no paddock left. But, you know, on occasion there's some areas where cultivation isn't possible. But unless there's a very good reason, direct drilling is a false economy. The amount of money that you save by not cultivating and not doing it properly is swallowed by the change that you get in your yield. And the expensive components of beet crop, and I think beet's a very cheap feed, there's no question around it, but on a per hectare basis it's cheap because you get massive yields. So, you know, a big crop's always a cheap crop and a little crop's always an expensive crop. So what happens in these cases is that you trade off the cost of, you know, cultivation and drilling, but you keep your fertilizer price, you keep your herbicide and pesticide prices. It's really not an effective economy. And my first advice would be don't do it. Having said that, it's very difficult to sow it into pastures. It doesn't tolerate much competition, number one. Number two, appropriate root development is really, really important in that early beet plant. Beet roots go down to 3 meters. and within 70 days of planting, they're at 1.5 metres down into the ground. I don't think a lot of producers realise that. So they set a very deep root and a very metabolically active root very early. And to do that, they have to have space and the ability in that soil. So in general terms, getting good establishment and pushing that crop on early are done by deep ripping or deep ploughing. And again, very difficult to do in direct drilling environments. In terms of the nutritional requirements, at the early sort of seedling stage, their nutritional requirements are a little bit of nitrogen, and most of the phosphorus that they're going to use is going to be in that early part there. They'll typically have enough boron, potassium, etc. to get through. The early component doesn't take a lot of their fertilizer use because it's a very low dry matter in the field at that point. It's later when their fertilizer use is a lot higher. So the nutrient requirements for nitrogen and then particularly for potassium are much stronger in late summer and early autumn.
Okay, we've got, we're away from agronomy now, and somebody is asking if steers can be finished on beet over winter in Scotland at a start weight of about 500 kilos, live weight. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, there's probably in the audience tonight, there'd be a number of people, and you'd certainly be aware of them because you've run that group very successfully for several years, and people who've done really well on beet in Scotland. So the short answer to that question would be absolutely. Of course, one of the really important components that we mentioned there was paddock selection and design. Well, paddock selection might in some cases also be seen as regional selection. So there's no question that there's some environments where you can grow really good beet crops, but you can't graze them, and particularly heavy stock, you can't graze them. I mean, if you've got really heavy wet soils, well, number one, there's an environmental issue in all likelihood. Number two, there'll probably end up being an animal welfare issue around that as well. And number three, we have a saying in New Zealand that cattle don't do well in the ground. They only do well if they're above the ground. So, you know, we're not talking about having no mud at all, but there's a difference between that and being up to their brisket in really heavy soils. And, you know, in those cases, the intakes aren't good and you won't have live weight gains. So there's some issues around that paddock selection that have to be there. But on the assumption that you've got the soil types and drainage and slopes to do it, absolutely. The cold weather and rain plays no role in it at all.
Yeah, and I have absolutely seen people finishing cattle on beet in the north here in Scotland and doing a really good job. So yes, absolutely doable. Next one is, what is the cost per acre? I'll maybe take this one for you, Jim. In Scotland, we're looking at a cost of usually about £300 to £400 an acre to establish. So you've got your seed cost, you've got extra herbicides compared to your Swedes. So you're looking at about double the cost of what you are to grow Swedes, but then you're getting a higher yield from your crop. So it is expensive. It does need looked after. Jim has spoken there about the weed control and the possibilities of crop failure if you're direct drilling it into, say, old grass, and it is more expensive, so it really is worth looking after. So it's definitely a crop to invest in.
Can I chip in a little bit there, Kirsten, too? I think it's really important because it was a conversation in beef and sheep farmers in New Zealand in the early years, more than it was in the dairy farmers, that people distinguish between the cost per acre and the cost per feed unit. You know, beet will be the cheapest feed on your farm. I mean, there's no getting around that. And that figure that we put up in the webinar was a real figure from 2020, approximately 5p per kilogram dry matter. Now, it would be very difficult for most people to buy even silage in at that similar sort of price. So it's important to look at it in terms of, you know, your likely yields. And that price at the moment is with the current UK yields. I'm pretty confident that the UK yields are going to follow the pattern of every other country that's altered the agronomy to be purposely fodder beet grazing agronomy and increase markedly. So I wouldn't be surprised if that figure is falling even lower. And on that basis, you know, it is a particularly cheap feed. It's just an investment that you have to do per acre or hectare first to get that result.
Okay, next question. We're skipping winter and we're looking to the summer. Can you clamp beet for long-term storage throughout the summer?
If you take the leaf off it and you put it in windrows, we can keep it for about 3 months. through our summer. So if we harvest it at the end of, we let it run right through till about when it's going to go to seed in spring, and we commercially harvest it, so blaze all the leaf off it and then keep it as bulb, and we do quite a lot of this, then we can keep it in windrows, uncovered windrows, out in the sun and the weather and whatever. We can keep it for about 3 months. That's really important to note though, because there was clearly a lot of sugar beet work done for many years in the UK, and they don't like keeping things in windrows for long periods of time in the weather. And it is true that it changes the sugar content of the bulb, but from a feeding point of view, it doesn't change the metabolizable energy content of the bulb. So just note there that there are changes in the bulb over that period of time. In the early years of research, we typed that very carefully. There's changes in dry matter, there's changes in other things, and if you really push it to the end, some of the bulbs are a pretty sorry looking lot when they're being fed out, but their palatability is identical, and their feed responses are identical. So there's no great issues with doing that. In winter, you can hold them for 6 months, but in summer, 3 months. Having said that, and depending where you are in Scotland, I suspect that your summers might be a bit cooler and a bit wetter than ours, and in those cases, you might find that you can keep them longer. Note though, I think the gentleman there said the use of a clamp. As a general rule, that doesn't work very well in warm weather. They're better to be put out in windrows where they get good ventilation and they're not stacked up in that. They tend to compress under their own weight and then begin this composting effect if they're in clamps. You have to be careful with that.
Okay, next one is a system question. Have you ever seen a system where sheep or cattle are back fenced as they graze the beet and then the other clean up behind them? Would this work, and which way around if it would?
No, we've never run those systems, although on a broader level, not exactly as that's been described, but it's not uncommon with, for example, wintering ewes going across beet. They don't eat very far into the ground, so they'll, depending on the cultivar, they'll eat to ground level. They'll eat the leaf, they'll eat to ground level, and then they'll leave that in the ground. Most farmers would wait till spring, early spring, then they'd grub that up with the tractor, and then some other livestock class would come across that and eat it all. And often cattle, or sometimes another class of sheep, would come across and pick it off and eat it all. So I guess that's slightly similar on a systems level, but the way that that's described, no. I wouldn't automatically be recommending the system as that was described, because going back to something we said before, the most benefit is made out of matching very carefully the amount of leaf and the amount of bulb. And the sweet spot for that is 25% leaf and 75% bulb. And therefore, the cultivars that are further out of the ground and they can use more of that bulb, give them that energy protein balance really well. Now, as you move into sheep and say, for example, multiple ewes with multiples that have a slightly higher protein requirement closer to lambing, there's some advantages in them not eating all of the bulb off because their crude protein of their diet's going up because they're leaving half of the bulb in the ground, and that bulb's a lower crude protein. So then they're only eating half the bulb and the leaf, so their total crude protein of their diet's going up. There's some advantages, but in terms of beef, no. The advantage in the beef systems is to have them eat all of that, and it's very difficult to keep that high intake up there. On top of that, back fencing can be problematic, particularly if they haven't got any shelter. That can also sometimes result in a lower intake. You know, to get the maximum profitability out of beef, and I guess we're always hunting for these absolute maximum live weight gains, we have to get maximum intake, and they can be a little bit sooky in various environments, and it's not hard to bump them off those maximum intakes. So we are pretty careful with them.
Great. 2 questions to go. Next one, we have grown beet for 2 years now, and we seem to be getting a lot of bolters. How do we overcome this?
So there's 2 different types of bolters that come into play with them. Depending, if you pull them up, some of the wild type bolters are very pale bulb. They look like a parsnip almost at the bottom, and they're the wild type bolters, and they typically have been a seed contamination. So there were a few varieties that whistled through the UK a few years back that were rotten with that seed contamination, and they probably left a lot in their wake. But if that gentleman or lady has been talking about the last couple of years, then there's pretty good seed control now, and you see less and less of them. the other type of bolter that you get, apart from that wild one, is the standard cultivar that you're using that just goes to early seed. And the driver for that in many cases is early planting. So if they're planted at lower temperatures, and I encourage that wherever possible because it often results in better yields, earlier planting wherever you can is normally an advantage. But it is true that if they get enough cold weather in that early period, that they then physiologically move over and you get an increased proportion of those bolters. If you're not involved in seed production, fodder beet or sugar beet seed production, and you haven't got seed production in your area, then we don't treat the bolters any differently. Like we don't have a roguing policy to pull all the bolters out and to leave that. And again, we inherited quite a lot of British agronomy on that, and seed production is very important in plenty of places in the UK. And the removal of all those bolters was seen as something that was really important. In the beef units, to be honest, we just eat them and don't really pay them any attention. And even in cases where that's been going on for 10 odd years, we haven't surmounted any difficulties there. So I'm normally not too worried by them. I would guess in the case this one, it might be cold weather. It's true that there are some cultivars that are prone to that. So one thing might be to think about what cultivar you've been using and to change it.
Okay, and the final question is, can you intersow some Italian ryegrass within the beet to act as the supplement?
Absolutely not. Here, let me be really clear for the Scottish audience on this one. That is a terrible idea. It's interesting. Interseeding is one of those ideas, or that inter-row cropping is one of those ideas that just seems to remain. I'm not exactly sure why. There's a few reasons why it doesn't work. The main problem is, and I'll put it in order, you don't need it. And you really just don't need it. If you achieve really good leafy crops with beet, then it's a very straightforward supplement input to them that you can do cheaply and more effectively in another way. So the first thing is you really don't need it. You don't need it for fibre, and there's other ways to do that in terms of supplying the protein. The second component is that beet as a crop is agronomically a challenge to get it right and to get it done really well, and it's very susceptible to competition, hates competition, and that grass will outcompete it easily without any difficulty at all in the early stages. We go to a lot of trouble with the herbicide programs not to have volunteer grass involved in those crops. So agronomically, it's also an extreme challenge. No, you're better to design your system so that you've got co-grazing if you can use that. And if you can't, to use really good quality silage and think about how you give it out.
There is people who are doing it, much to Jim's hate to think, that are doing it in windy sites to try and protect the crop. And there is definitely, there's mixed response to how they're getting on, that's for sure.
I'll add one on that one, Kirsten, with interseeding for wind and then, spraying it out later. We have tried that for many years in some really challenging windy environments in New Zealand, and we've never, ever had any success in it. I mean, there's other ways to do it with strip tilling and cereal stubbles and other bits and pieces, but, you say mixed responses, and I know exactly what you mean. And generally, the consensus in the end is you lose more than you gain. So wherever possible, I discourage farmers from doing it.
Okay, so we thank you so much, Jim, for all your time. I know questions have gone on quite a while there, but there's been some excellent questions. And just to highlight, we've got the last one in this series next Wednesday, and that is going to be a focus on dairy. So please tune into that or let people know that are dairy farming. The other thing just to highlight is we've got 3 podcasts. The first 2 are just about to be released, recorded with Jim. And the first one is looking at transition allocation, so how to go about doing yield analysis and how to feed it out. And then the second one is more species specific, so looking at cattle and sheep separately, and then some of the common problems and common myths. The final one will be on health. Tomorrow you'll get an email just asking for evaluation on tonight's webinar, so please, if you can fill that in, that would be much appreciated. It just lets us see if the webinars that we're delivering are ticking your boxes basically, and lets us see where to go with the future. So thank you, Jim, so much for all of your knowledge tonight. It's been absolutely fantastic. The brain will be exploding tonight, that's for sure. And thank you, everybody, for joining.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the audience for maintaining us with this time. So, good evening.
Thank you.
Bye.